Hi, and welcome to another episode of Casual Learning. I'm your host, John Bannan. So, what's the deal with the meaning of life? This is a question that many people have attempted to answer. And the answers vary greatly. Um, but it does actually have an answer. And it's an answer that can be logically deduced fairly simply. Um, so the first question you need to ask is, well, what do you mean by the meaning of life? Meaning is a purpose. It's purpose. So what is the purpose of life or your life? And when you ask that question, well, what's the purpose of your life? You have to ask, well, why were you created? And to answer that question, you also have to ask, who created you? So if you want to understand what the meaning of life is, you have to understand why you were created and who created you. Well, in terms of who created you, there is really only two answers to that question. And it depends somewhat on whether there's a God or not. I've shown you in earlier videos why there is a God, and more specifically why you should believe in the Christian God. So, for purposes of this video, I'm simply going to assume there is a God, and it is the Christian God. All right, so who created you? Well, two possibilities. First possibility is the universe created you. There was a big bang, and billions and billions of years go by, and the planets form, and the sun forms, and the earth forms, and life processes evolve and develop on the surface of the earth. And that eventually results in humanity, and that eventually results in you. So, in a broad sense, you could say your creator is the universe. The other creator is God. And of course, God created the universe. So anything the universe does is God's doing. So the ultimate creator is God. But we'll also talk about the universe. In terms of the universe creating you, the universe itself is not a living thing. It doesn't have a mind. It's simply matter and energy. So, asking the question, well, why did the universe create you, doesn't make a lot of sense because the universe doesn't have a consciousness. It didn't decide to create you for any particular reason or purpose. So, in that sense, because the universe, strictly speaking, is a non-intelligent force, then there would be no meaning or purpose for your creation. Therefore, there is no meaning to your life. However, if you want to ask, well, what about the purpose of the mechanisms that created us, even though they're not intelligent in any sense? Were they meant to accomplish some sort of purpose? And you can argue that yes, there is some sort of purpose, not strictly a designed purpose, but a purpose nonetheless. And you know, what was the thing on Earth that created humans? And the answer is evolution. Evolution created humans. Evolution is an idea that was thought up of by Charles Darwin. Uh, the idea is that life is in a state of constant competition for resources, even against other life. And this necessitates a need for adaptation of that life in order to survive and reproduce. So, in terms of evolution, the purpose of life, in order to be present today on this planet, is to survive and reproduce effectively, to be able to be here today with us. So, life itself is a chemical process that occurs on the surface of the Earth. It's driven by essentially the energy of the sun, but it's created life forms through the use of a molecule like DNA. These life forms are in constant competition with other life forms, and they're in competition for food supplies, and then there's other uh, uh, influences on its environment that can kill it off. So life has to be very, very good at adapting to its environment in order to continue to exist and survive. And that the whole mechanism for survival for life is survival and reproduction. So, if there is a meaning that you can ascribe to evolution and life, it's to reproduce and survive. Reproduce and survive. That's essentially the meaning of life in an evolutionary sense, to reproduce and survive. Uh, you know, this is highlighted by the fact that you can ask another question, which is, well, what's the meaning of death? Why do we die? And the answer to that is it's tied to evolution. Evolution could adapt and make changes to our DNA that allow us to survive indefinitely, until we get killed off by an accident or something like that. But it could do that. I mean, what's more complicated? Evolving a human brain or evolving the capacity to live forever? Well, the human brain is much, much more complicated a mechanism than creating a life form that can live forever or permanently. So if life can, if evolution can create a human brain, why can't it create an organism that lives forever? It can create an organism that lives forever. It simply doesn't. Why is that? Well, the reason is because life doesn't want to keep you around too long. It only wants to keep you around long enough for you to survive and reproduce. And once you've done that, you have no more real purpose in terms of evolution for your existence. So it has no reason to keep you around any longer. Now, why is that? Well, because the way evolution works is your genes are constantly undergoing genetic mutations. And those genetic mutations are passed off to offspring. And some of those genetic mutations are beneficial. And they're what allows the life form to adapt to its environment and survive longer. The environment's always changing, so DNA also has to constantly change and update itself in order to survive in a changing environment. If it doesn't do that, the species will die off. So as an analogy, you can kind of think of it as a software version. Like my software version would be 1.0. My kids' version would be 2.0. Their kids' version would be 3.0. Well, you can see evolution is constantly updating our code. And that updated code is essential to being able to adapt and continue to survive in a changing environment. But it's also important that older versions of that code don't stay around too long and continue to reproduce and continue to spread their old code, because that will slow down the rate of adaptation and make it much more difficult for the species to survive. So evolution, after I reproduce it, it doesn't want my software, my older software code, my 1.0, continuing to pass on its information to offspring. It wants the updated codes to reproduce and spread their updated software, not my older software, my older code. So it has no reason to keep me around. And so it doesn't create or adapt to keep me around longer, and I simply die off. That's the meaning of death. It's to speed up the process of evolution, to make it more efficient, to make sure that the species can survive. So the meaning of death is to ensure the survival of the species. That's why you die. But it also highlights the fact that the process of evolution, keeping the species alive and surviving, is really the meaning of life in terms of a strict evolutionary sense and a strict what is the universe doing when it's creating human life? And the answer pretty clearly is reproduction and survival. That's it. That's all there is. The second creator is God. So, why did God create you? Why are you here? Well, if you look to what Jesus told us, the reason for your existence is for you to obtain eternal life in heaven, eternal bliss with God. Or in the alternative, if you don't do what Jesus wants you to do, or if Jesus doesn't deem you worthy of eternal life, then it's eternal punishment in hell. So what's the meaning here? The meaning is eternal life. So when you look at the only two possible creators, and what the purpose of human life would be to them, it comes down to these two things: reproduction and survival, and the goal of eternal life after death. That's it. That's all there is. Some people may say that we create our own meaning. Your meaning is whatever you want it to be, whatever you feel you should do. Well, this is simply false. It's false. A meaning is given to you by a creator. You cannot give yourself meaning because you did not create yourself. And you couldn't create yourself. It's illogical. So you cannot logically give yourself meaning because you didn't create yourself. Only your creator can give you purpose or meaning. So the suggestion that you create your own meaning in life is factually inaccurate. It's wrong. It's wrong. This is it. That's all there is. These are the only meanings there are to life. Now, if you look at these two answers here, they're interesting for one important reason, and that is they're pretty easily accessible to all human beings. How do you obtain eternal life? Well, you do God's will. You do God's will, God has mercy on you and gives you eternal life. So this is accessible to everybody. Reproduction and survival is basically available to everybody. I know there might be, some exceptional cases where there's some sort of defect that they're not capable of reproducing. But those are exceptional cases. But generally, 99.99% of humanity is capable of obtaining their purpose and meaning in life. Reproduction and survival, all you have to do is survive and have children and help and make sure those children survive so that they can have children. That's it. That's all there is. That's the total sum of all the meaning in life that there is, with the addition of eternal life in heaven after you die, by doing God's will. And how do you know God's will? Well, read the Bible, read the New Testaments, read what Jesus Christ had to say in the Gospels. So if you look at these two meanings, it's interesting because let's say you're born here, you die here, and this is the afterlife. So, from this point, from your birth to your death, the meaning of life is survival and reproduction and obtaining eternal life. And then after death, what's the meaning? The meaning is eternal life in heaven with God. So these two answers cover the whole expanse of your existence. Now, an important thing to remember is that these two answers are accessible to 99.9999% of humanity. In terms of the purpose and meaning of life, it's obtainable by everybody. You don't need any special talents or knowledge. You don't need money. You don't need status. You don't need special physical talents. So you should remember that every human being is fully capable of satisfying the purpose and meaning of life, and that we're all equal in a very profound sense. So you shouldn't look down on other people because they're as good as you are in terms of, the big question. What is the meaning of life? Okay, if you like what you hear today, please press the subscribe button below. If you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comments below, and I'll answer them in the comments or maybe in a future installment of this video. Okay, take care, guys.